In 1965, the Prime Minister of Singapore stood in front of a television camera and cried. Not because he had won something, not because something great had happened. He cried because Singapore had just been expelled from Malaysia, thrown out of the federation it had voluntarily joined just 2 years earlier. Kicked out, told it wasn't wanted. The separation was not planned or desired by Singapore's leadership. Political and racial tensions forced Singapore out of the federation. What he was left with was genuinely terrifying. A tiny island of fewer than 2 million people with no natural resources, no oil, no gas, no minerals, no agricultural land worth speaking of. Surrounded by larger, hostile neighbors, with the population divided along racial and religious lines. Unemployment is nearly at 14%, and British military bases, which accounted for 1/5 of the entire economy, about to be withdrawn. In 1960, Singapore's GDP per capita was just $3,600. Today, it stands at over $67,000, and when adjusted for purchasing power, it exceeds $132,000, making it the highest in the world. So, what happened? How did a country that was crying on television in 1965 become richer per capita than the United States, Germany, and Japan in less than 60 years? The answer isn't a miracle. It was a cold, calculated, and often ruthless blueprint that inverted the entire global economic order, weaponized their geography, and turned a defenseless island into an untouchable global monopoly. Kuan Yew was Singapore's first prime minister, in office from 1959 to 1990, a tenure that made him the world's longest-serving prime minister in history. He was a Cambridge-educated lawyer, fluent in 5 languages, and possessed of a political philosophy that was entirely his own, one that didn't fit neatly into either the Western democratic model or the communist alternative that was sweeping through Asia at the time. Lee believed that development required discipline, that a poor country couldn't afford the luxury of unfocused freedom, that corruption was not just a moral failing, but an economic catastrophe, and that eliminating it entirely was a prerequisite for everything else. That education was not a social program, but a national survival strategy. When Singapore became independent in 1965, Lee and his economic team faced a question that every developing nation faces. What do you build your economy around? Most developing countries in the 1960s answered that question with natural resources, such as oil, minerals, timber, and agriculture. Singapore had none of those. Singapore's lack of natural resources and an industrial base forced it to look abroad for investment and productive capacity. It looked to the example of Israel, which managed to leapfrog its Arab neighbors as an example of developing without resources. The logic was elegant. If Singapore had nothing to export, it would become the place where everyone else's goods passed through. It would be the hub, the port, the financial center, the logistics gateway between East and West. It would sell not commodities but services, reliability, efficiency, rule of law, zero corruption, and a government that kept its word to investors. Singapore's success can be attributed to free trade and free capital. Its clampdown on corruption and crime also played a major role in attracting investment. Furthermore, its government was intimately involved in developing several key sectors of the economy, such as shipbuilding and electronics. The foreign investment came first in manufacturing, then in finance, then in pharmaceuticals and technology. Multinational corporations discovered that Singapore was the one place in Southeast Asia where the rules were clear, the courts were honest, the infrastructure worked, and nobody was going to steal from them. In a region where corruption was endemic, that was an extraordinary competitive advantage. But economic growth means nothing if the country tears itself apart from the inside. A wealthy state with a fractured, warring society is just a wealthy, failed state. This is where Singapore executed its most brilliant and socially invasive internal masterstroke, the Housing and Development Board, or HDB. In 1965, the majority of Singaporeans lived in unhygienic wooden shophouses or illegal squatter settlements. The government understood a fundamental truth of statecraft. If you are a poor, disenfranchised immigrant with no property, you have no stake in the survival of the country. You are ripe for communist radicalization, and you will retreat into ethnic tribalism at the first sign of trouble. The government didn't just build public housing. They effectively forced the population to buy it. They utilized a mandatory social security savings scheme called the Central Provident Fund, the CPF. By legally extracting a massive chunk of every citizen's paycheck and mandating employer contributions, the state forced its population to save. The government then channeled those massive capital reserves directly into rapidly building sprawling high-rise apartment complexes. Today, over 80% of Singaporeans live in HDB apartments, most of which they own. This is not just a housing statistic, it's a social transformation. Home ownership gives people a stake in the country's stability and success. It builds wealth for ordinary families. It creates the kind of social cohesion that makes economic development self-reinforcing rather than constantly threatened by inequality and instability. Lee made a decision early that Singapore's education system would be relentlessly practical. It would not produce philosophers or poets. It would produce scientists, engineers, doctors, and business people. The curriculum was designed around economic needs. The results were extraordinary. More hospitals were opened with more appointed doctors and nurses. The unemployment rate declined from 13.5% to 1.7%. Within a generation, Singapore went from having a largely unskilled workforce to producing some of the highest achieving students in the world. Today, Singapore consistently ranks first or second globally in mathematics and science education. Not because Singaporeans are naturally more talented, but because the system was engineered to produce that outcome. They crafted an external balancing act so sophisticated it borders on geopolitical art. Singapore made itself indispensable to both the US and China simultaneously, without ever fully committing to either. They quietly allowed the United States Navy to use their deep-water Changi Naval Base, providing a critical, highly secure logistics hub for American aircraft carriers and nuclear submarines seeking to project power in the Western Pacific. By positioning itself as the trusted, neutral broker where East meets West, Singapore ensured that if any regional power attacked the island, they wouldn't just be fighting the Singapore Armed Forces. For decades, Western critics dismissed Singapore as a sterile clinical experiment. But as the 21st century grinds on, facing deep systematic crises across Western democratic models, crises marked by crumbling infrastructure, paralyzing political polarization, soaring crime rates, and skyrocketing inequality, Singapore's model of hyper-efficient, long-term technocratic planning looks less like a bizarre anomaly and more like an incredibly attractive, viable alternative for developing nations worldwide. Singapore proved that a country doesn't need a massive landmass. It doesn't need vast reserves of fresh water, and it doesn't need a single drop of oil to dominate the global order. It just needs to build a monopoly that the world simply cannot afford to break. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe.